Thank you so much. It is a real honor to be here. And in this current age, education technology is only getting bigger. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kick us off with a few principles of what we know about education technology and when it works and when it doesn't work. And as we think about investing in education technology, what we need to make sure that we keep in mind. And I will also think about how all the latest technologies with artificial intelligence feed into that. And so, four lessons from global evidence. So first, before I jump into the lessons, obviously education technology is big business. Estimates of the EdTech market in basic education range dramatically. I've seen estimates from 78 billion US dollars to 124 billion US dollars. And so we don't know exactly how much it is, but it's a lot and it's growing. But of course, the track record on the impact of education technology on education outcomes is decidedly mixed. And so this figure that I'm showing you here is the impact of this drawing on PISA, so International Student Assessment data, looking at the impact of time on devices in literacy and language arts classrooms and how that was associated with changes in reading scores over time. And what you can see, the main takeaway here is that most of these numbers are negative. So, on average, the way schools in a lot of parts of the world have been using devices has not led to net improvements. And as a parent who has children in schools where they use devices a fair amount, this kind of finding certainly gives me pause. Now, um, lest I seem like a cynic, we do see some successes. So just at the end of last year, we saw a new study that came out that evaluated a relatively large scale personalized adaptive learning software implementation in India. So in this intervention, they replaced between a quarter and a half of math or language instructional time with time at the computer lab, where they were using a software, in this case, MindSpark, that tutored children in math and in language, in this case, Hindi. The teachers were present, they were managing the program, they were answering questions students have, managing the classroom. And what we see from this is that as a result, over the course of a couple of years, students who participated in this program learned 50 to 66% more than students who were just, business as usual participating in school. And that the highest gains were for the lowest performers. But we also see gains, and this you can see this in the figure on the right. The blue is the treatment group, the red is the control group. And what you see here is that for students at the bottom of the distribution, so students who were low performers at the beginning, those are students at the left of the graphs, and students on the right of the graphs, high performers at baseline, all of them saw improvements. Furthermore, teachers and students both found it useful. Teachers don't always find EdTech interventions useful, which we'll talk about. And now the program's in more than 2,000 schools, reaching more than 250,000 students. And so, just like we see some examples where the ed tech has adverse effects, we see some examples with positive effects. So how can we maximize the probability that effects are positive as we invest in education technology? One is it's always important to remember the landscape, right? And so these are data on how many schools have access to electricity, right? In East Asia, in Latin America, in the Middle East. In South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, those numbers are much lower. If we look at schools that have computers available for pedagogy, right, we see a similar pattern, right? Although it's lower across the board. But we can see in South Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa for primary and lower secondary, those aren't zeros. Those are just missing data. But you can see fewer than half of schools, even in upper secondary, where you might expect them to most have access to computers for pedagogy, those numbers are less than half. And from the Global Education Monitoring Report that was released just this morning, it reminds us that there are still lots of children who aren't even completing school. So when we think about ed tech, we think about AI, most of these are implemented through the school environment. We have to remember there are a lot of schools that don't have power, a lot of schools that don't have devices, and many kids who still aren't actually in school, and making sure that we think about ed tech that isn't going to widen inequalities by only reaching the kids who have access to the best devices. Okay, so principle one. Technology is not the solution to the learning crisis, right? Whatever the specific learning crisis the countries have, I have seen over and over again in years of meeting with ministries of education, the genuine belief, maybe it's a hope as much as anything, that technology can kind of solve our problems by kind of tossing it at the problem, right? What technology can do is solve very specific problems within the context of the learning crisis. And so examples of just using technology and hoping it'll solve math problems, mass distribution of hardware or internet access, those by themselves have been very ineffective. One laptop per child programs. This was an initiative where people really believed that if we just give kids laptops and freedom, then they will learn. This has been evaluated very carefully in multiple contexts in Peru, especially with both short and long run, and found absolutely no impact on learning. Now, on the other hand, if we say, well, we have a very specific problem. So, for example, in a lot of countries, it's challenging to get as many highly qualified teachers in specialized subjects into remote schools, right? You can't always have an advanced physics teacher in a remote secondary school. And so a number of countries have experimented with using TV lessons to upgrade the quality, complemented by a classroom teacher who might not have quite as advanced skills. And those have shown positive effects in Mexico, in Ghana, in parts of India. And so education technology can help us solve specific micro problems, but it won't by itself solve the macro problem. Obviously, as we think about artificial intelligence, if we, AI by itself leads to students just cheating. And when they encounter a difficult problem, just asking, hey, solve this problem for me. And getting answers and skipping that learning process. Whereas on the other hand, we have some evidence that artificial intelligence tutors with guardrails to make sure that students don't skip ahead to the end can be effective in boosting learning. So that's principle one. Principle two for education technology investments. If you're going to invest in the tech, you have to remember that you have to invest in a whole lot more, right? And so there are a number of programs where this has failed. Programs, if there's tech, there needs to be significant training and support to get these programs integrated, to get the tech integrated into the education system. There needs to be monitoring to see if people are actually using the program. So there was a virtual coaching program, teacher coaching, in South Africa that in the first year, it actually looked just as effective as in-person coaching. It was much cheaper. It could reach a lot more teachers at once. And so this seemed really, really effective. After that first year, though, the effects completely dissipated, whereas in-person coaching, the effects endured. And the reason was the teachers just stopped logging in. So teachers are busy and they stopped logging into the virtual coaching sessions after the first semester and a half. Maintenance. So funders often really like funding investments like new laptops or a new system. What they don't love funding is repairs and maintenance. And a great example of this was a laptop program in Paraguay where they rolled out these laptops, but then many of them broke and there were just no resources or an infrastructure in place to do consistent, constant repairs. And so within a year, you'd lost most of the functionality of the program. So an example of this in the new artificial intelligence era, there's an evaluation by De Simon and others from the World Bank where they combined human tutors with AI. And and they showed some positive effects, but in order to implement this, they had to provide routers. They had to make efforts to increase the consistency of the internet access, because as we saw earlier, many schools, including in Nigeria, just don't have that. And so if we want to invest in the tech, we need to make sure that we budget for all the things around the tech that will give it the chance to work. Principle three, testing the technology. So implementation matters, and I cross that out. It really, really matters. And so we've seen this again and again where programs that look relatively similar actually perform very differently in different contexts because, in part, they've been implemented very differently. So, a program in China, for example, that provided computer assisted learning. So, what this learning was supposed to do was it was supposed to, outside of regular subject matter areas, when they were supposed to be having this computer lab hour, they would use this computer assisted learning. Students would work on programs to boost their language skills. When an NGO implemented that as it was supposed to be implemented, it had positive impacts. They used this computer class time, it was effective. When that was shifted to government implementation, right? Then suddenly you found, less motivated teachers and school leaders who started substituting actual regular instructional time with the computer assisted learning. So instead of just using that computer class time, they were actually using English class time to do the computer assisted learning, and the impact disappeared. Right. And so often when we have NGO implementation, there's high motivation. When we have pilot implementation, there's strong monitoring. We have to make sure that we test and that we test within the systems that we actually can use to make sure this works. An example of this, there was a chatbot intervention, chatbot tutors for students that boosted learning outcomes while the students had access to the chatbots. But as soon as the chatbots were taken away, student learning outcomes actually dropped. And that was because there weren't enough guardrails around to keep students from cheating. And so that's why testing the technology is so crucial. Principle 4, EdTech only works with buy-in. So in almost every case, teachers, schools have to integrate the technology. And if they don't, then it won't have an impact. So for example, in Colombia, there was a program where they implemented, where they distributed laptops, computers, set up computer labs in schools. But teachers weren't convinced that it would actually help them cover the curriculum, so they never integrated them and they were never used. A laptop distribution program in Brazil was visited about a year later, and 2/3 of the laptops had just never been removed from their cases because teachers and schools hadn't bought into how they could actually be effective in boosting student learning. So the program in India that I mentioned as a win early on, then this at scale computer assisted personally adapted learning, they identified a central role for teachers. They framed it to teachers as helping them deliver differentiated instructions, right? In one fifth grade class, teachers had students whose learning levels were at the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth grade level. Very difficult to teach all those students at once. And so it was framed as helping and complementing these teachers' efforts. And then there was also someone in charge of the computer lab where students were doing this learning. So there was no additional administrative burden for teachers. We need buy-in if this is going to work. If we want artificial intelligence interventions, likewise, teachers are still the implementers for in-school use, which is where we'll get the use that won't exacerbate inequalities because it's just relying on which students have access to technology at home. So artificial intelligence obviously has the potential to strengthen lots of aspects of education. And so, for example, right, we have, like when it comes to teachers, attraction. There's a program in Chile that used chatbots to provide students with detailed information about how they could become a teacher, what the returns to becoming a teacher were, right? Professional development. We already have artificial intelligence applications that are, for example, giving teachers feedback on how many questions they're asking, how much time students are talking versus how much time teachers are talking. There's a great, in terms of automating routine tasks, there's a great evaluation out of Brazil where an artificial intelligence is used to help teachers grade essays, resulted in both better feedback on the essays, on teachers spending more time having substantive conversations with students rather than just grading, and then ultimately resulted in better results on college applications. With students, obviously, there's personalized learning. There's also, with tutors that have guardrails. There's also help with assignments in terms of like helping students edit their assignments, right? Improving their language if they're set up with the right guardrails. And then also in educational administration, streamlining processes, proactive detection of children at dropout risk. Resource allocation. There's a program in Ecuador that helped student teachers who were applying for teaching positions, but who were at risk of not getting one, find better matches. So there are lots of possibilities on the frontier, lots of pilots happening in all of these areas. We just have to remember that the principles still apply. Principle one, what is the specific problem that this AI or any other EdTech intervention is trying to solve? Principle two, are all the complementary resources in place for maintenance, for solving problems, for recognizing harm? Principle three, testing. Does it actually boost student learning? Also, what are the impacts beyond test scores, right? Are students forming unhealthy attachments in ways that we don't want? We have to test these to make sure that we're observing and minimizing harm while maximizing benefits. And principle four, how do we get students, teachers, parents, and school leaders on board? These are all crucial as we think about educational technology investments in 2026 and beyond. Thank you very much.